Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading are changing forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, covering topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and resilience, and from climate change to AI. If it's about the status of leadership in 2026, it will be on our podcasts.
And we're not here for the shiny corporate case studies. We share stories from leaders who have learned lessons and made progress the hard way. Our podcast is here to share ideas and inspire others.
In this episode, we're joined by Babith Bhoopalan, the Seattle-based founder of Quantum Leap Insights and former Microsoft director. His research into AI and careers began at his kitchen table when his daughter Thea asked him a simple question: am I studying the right things?
Drawing on 17 authoritative sources, including the World Economic Forum, Goldman Sachs, and McKinsey, Babith built a free framework that scores 35 plus careers for AI resistance. His tools have now reached over 30,000 families across 128 countries, and our conversation is one that every parent and leader should listen to.
But before we get to our conversation with Babith, there's another big story this week that every parent and child, especially in this house, is paying attention to. And that is the UK government's plan to ban social media for anyone under the age of 16.
So there are several big themes emerging from this plan that I think resonate when lined up against the conversation that we're about to share with you with Babith. The ban itself and what that means, the learning and development angle, which is probably, I think, the most interesting aspect of it all. And then the thing that worries me most, I think, is the potential for isolation of our young people, especially in the early years of the ban, where it will come into effect. My sense is, off the cuff, the ban is a fairly knee-jerk reaction to a much more nuanced challenge. On the face of it, a ban is quite a simple thing. We have to only look back to January at the example of a similar ban in Australia, and Keir Starmer, dearly departed Keir Starmer, who resigned this morning as we record the 22nd of June, talked about how this was going to be an Australia plus ban, so taking the lessons learned from our Australian friends and enforcing them even more. I think that the challenge is that we're not really sure who the ban is protecting. There's a lot of stuff I've read around this today, and most of the commentary seems to be that the people that actually get the best deal out of this ban are the social media platforms themselves, because they get to make even more money because they understand exactly the demographic that's on their platforms, because we are all going to need to sign up through an age verification platform, which is a very expensive thing, which the big social media platforms can absorb the cost of. But the smaller platforms and the smaller places where children might spend their time are going to be really challenged, especially those within the charity sector, I would imagine.
Well, the reaction to this has been quite mixed, hasn't it? Which chimes with some of the discussions we've had earlier on this podcast with the likes of Chris Sherwood from NSPCC about online safety. And it's very hard to create a consensus about these issues, isn't it? And I can see why, because in some ways it's a very personal decision whether your kids go on social media or not. But then there's also these other challenges, I think, about what do we want to allow young people to access to, and also how much responsibility and autonomy we need to give young people as well. And that's really hard because, as I have learned the hard way, embarking on the teenage years with both of my kids, who are now 13 and 15, adolescence goes on for a very long time, or maybe it just feels like that. And the gulf between, say, a 13-year-old navigating their way around a very new online world, right through to a 16-year-old when they're going to be a completely different person. You're talking about two very different stages of life, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, and we have to sort of open up the demographic even more. We have a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old. So the 17-year-old has waltzed through the last few years on all of these channels, from an appropriate age, We've opened things up, like he is on Instagram, he's had Snapchat for a while, and they've grown up with these in their pockets, and the
Mm.
expectation that sets with our 14-year-old that, well, that's the path I'm going to get on now. So when can I have access to Instagram, mum, dad? Those sorts of questions have fired around. And as I said just before we started recording, my youngest asked me yesterday morning when he heard the news about Keir Starmer potentially resigning, well, does that mean that the ban won't go into effect? And I said, I don't think it works that way. But the other thing that you'd learn from the Australian side of things, I think a statistic I saw earlier on was 7 in 10 Australian under 16s who are subject of this ban have already found ways around it for most of the apps that they
Uh,
actually use. So, the ingenuity of children or users of the internet more generally is that we'll always find a way around these bans anyway. And then it becomes a question, like you say, of, what you as a parent, what you as a guardian of your children are allowing access to. And there's something for me about the relative safety. I know that we've talked about how access to these channels can be problematic, and we've had those conversations with our guests in the past. But I think there is also this real challenge of, if you take away the platforms that are in plain sight, where do our children go next? And do they find darker places where, they are sort of going back to what we always said with social media, right? People are doing it under the tables on their phones. You don't need to be accessing these channels in plain sight to be accessing them. They will find a way.
yeah, exactly. Are they all going to end up on Telegram or some terrible corner of the dark web? It's a real worry, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is. And I think then there's the other challenge, or the other part of it that I think is really going to be a problem, is that we also grow up in, or they are growing up in, an era where they are taught in school to remember facts, and remember facts for a period of time, which basically sees them through an exam. So they are told and taught in a way that you just remember these things and you will get through the exam, and then that sort of knowledge passes through. I see my kids using YouTube in particular and TikTok as a sort of a search engine to find out information that they need to know at school. And I don't think school, whether they ban use of phones in the classroom, they don't always ban use of social media to go off and find the answers you're looking for. So they are using these channels in a way that is educational. That's the learning and development point I mentioned earlier. And if you do take these away, where are they then going to find that? Are they going to get the same
Mm.
level of input in school? And also the ingenuity of using these apps and using them to be creative, to make connections, to build a life. We've talked a lot about the influence of COVID and how children were sort of drawn to screens during that time, and that we haven't really recovered from that. I just wonder, if you take some of these channels away, particularly things like YouTube and TikTok, from a generation that's grown up using them, what are you actually achieving?
And what are the alternatives as well? I mean, I'm going to sound like a bit of a nana saying this, but we all know that there is not so much provision for the things that young people could go out and do offline. Obviously, there's amazing charities like the Scouts, for example,
Hmm.
and youth charities, but we know that there's also a real lack of funding, right? So the death of youth clubs and all of those things. So if we want to get kids offline, we should really be providing them with more things to do offline, shouldn't we?
Yeah. And that's often the way they find these things as well. If they've got a special interest in something and they find a community that they want to connect with online, they will find their way to them. And there was just something that came through on email today about a new course at school for music, DJing, and music creation. And I don't know. You might use an app on your phone or on your computer, like GarageBand or something, to be creative and create something. Where are you going to share that? That's what you're
Oh.
sharing on these channels. You're saying, here's something I created and here's a community of people I want to share it with. And suddenly that's taken away from you and shut down. One of the questions I asked my 14-year-old this morning was, how many of your friends have active YouTube channels that they've put time and effort into building up? He didn't know the answer, but I'm sure there'll be one of two of them in the school that have quite decent followings from
Mm.
doing stuff that really, really interests them online.
It's a very good point. And when you hear stories of entrepreneurs, quite often they started out when they were very young, and there will be kids who leave school at 16 or 18 where they're really in their sandbox era with digital, right? So they might be building a little following online, and it might be nothing to do what they ultimately end up doing or the business they end up running. But it is important for young people to have these spaces to try out these channels safely, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I also think, the reason why I think this was quite pertinent to today is we're going to move into a conversation in a minute with Babbitt where he's talking about skills that aren't going to be easily replaced by AI and giving young people practice online or offline to practice those skills, I think is really important. So if you think about something like empathy, that can be developed online and offline as much as each other. I mean, it's got its challenges online, but I'm sure we've all seen situations where young people have developed that empathy through a conversation or a chat or a messaging platform with their friends. The reverse can be true. The reverse is what we're trying to fight back against here, isn't it? The reverse, which is the hate speech and things like that that children will encounter online. So I'm not saying there isn't any danger here. There is. But what I think is it's a much more nuanced conversation than just an outright ban. And I think that's what we're getting to with the conversation around AI, or seemingly with last episode, we talked about the Pope's intervention and others having a more nuanced conversation about what AI means to the world. Perhaps we need to take a step back and look at what this means for our young people. What are we actually taking away by banning this?
We'll definitely come back to this topic on future podcasts, I'm sure. But for now, here's our conversation with Babith Bhoopalan. We are super excited to be joined by Babith Bhoopalan on the podcast today. Babith is a Seattle based founder of Quantum Leap Insights and a former director at Microsoft, where he spent 25 years working at the heart of AI and enterprise technology across product, engineering, partnerships, and customer strategy. He has advised some of the world's largest organizations on making AI work in the real world. But the work that has defined the last year of his life started not in a boardroom, but at a kitchen table. When his daughter Thea began thinking seriously about her future, Babbitt found himself doing what any parent would do. He started researching. What he discovered unsettled him. The careers that families assumed were safe were not always the ones that the data protected. The entry points that graduates had relied on for generations were quietly disappearing, and the guidance available to households was either too technical, too generic, or simply too late. So he built something, drawing on 17 authoritative sources, including the World Economic Forum, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, and Stanford. He developed a framework that scores 35 plus careers for AI resistance and identifies the 4 human capabilities that AI cannot replicate. He turned that research into 2 free tools: an interactive AI career guide and an AI career playbook generator, and put them online for any family to use. Thea's own path, which the research helped to clarify and strengthen, led her to choose international relations. Babbitt realised that if this process had been useful for one household, it could be useful for many. He was right. The tools have now reached 25,000 plus downloads across 109 countries in a matter of weeks. The response has been extraordinary. The Wall Street Journal, the Sunday Times, BBC Radio 4, the Seattle Times, and the Toronto Star have all covered Babbitt's work, with further major international publications in the pipeline. Babbitt has keynoted the 30th APDC Congress in Lisbon alongside the Portuguese government and is currently exploring collaboration opportunities with the UN Youth Office in New York. Both tools remain permanently free and we'll link to them in the show notes. That is not a business decision, it is a conviction. And I think that says an awful lot about the amazing leader that Babbitt is. Babbitt, thank you for joining us today. What an amazing story you have, and it's such a pleasure to have you here.
Zoe and Paul, genuinely delighted to be here. I actually started following Starts at the Top podcast, after we connected. And I have to say that you could not have really picked a more urgent moment for this conversation that we're going to have today, right? So every leader listening right now, I mean, they either have a child asking the same question as my daughter asked me, or they have people in their organization who are parents and they have been asked the same question. So this feels like exactly the right room to be in right now. And I'm really keen to look at your questions and address your audience.
Well, thank you, Babith. It's just brilliant to have you here. And just by way of background for our listeners, this conversation came about today because I opened the Times one Saturday and read your amazing article, which really spoke to some of the things I've been worried about. And I know Paul's thought a lot about with his own children. So my kids are 13 and 15. Paul's are also teenagers. And on this podcast, we have talked a lot about what on earth do we do in terms of guiding our children about what careers they should look at and what they should study at university in the age of AI, because it feels like all of these paths are kind of breaking, aren't they, under the weight of this huge tech disruption. So when we read about your career playbook and your amazing resources, it was a relief and it was super exciting as well, because it feels like there are still opportunities for young people. It gave me hope.
100%. I mean, when I really started this research, I thought that I was probably going to find a story about jobs disappearing, just to what you mentioned, the doom and gloom scenarios that we see all over social media and the press today. But what I actually found was, you know, a much more specific and I believe a far more urgent story that needs to be put out there. If you talk about, what came out of the research, few of the numbers that genuinely pushed me back really hard back on my seat were like 89% of new graduates, they now fear AI will replace their entry level role. So the fear is real. I mean, that is really, if you look at comparisons, that's up from 64% just about a year back. And when you really look at what is happening in the UK labor market specifically, I mean, my research was centered a lot around, the North American market, but with the news kind of spreading, I really expanded that capability into other markets as well. In the UK market, that fear is not irrational at all. I mean, if you look at what KPMG's data says, KPMG cut graduate hiring by 29%. This is out there in the public, and Deloitte, which is another big five, they cut it by 18%. Ernst and Young by 11%. UK accountancy job listings that I was looking at, that is actually down 44% year on year. Um, and UK tech graduate roles, that has dropped by almost 46%, since 2025. But here is the thing I really, to your point, Zoe, I really want and wish every parent understood, when they can sift through that doom and gloom, news information that is coming out today. AI is really not threatening your child's entire career. What it is doing is it is, collapsing the first 2 or 3 years of it. And what you actually termed it correctly as the bottom rung, the entry point, right? The place where young people used to go to learn the basics, for example, understanding data by doing data analysis, building documentation to put their story out, building the foundations. Now that layer is being automated at blitzkrieg speed at this moment with AI. So that distinction matters enormously in terms of what is happening to the careers. And, because if you think AI is going to obliterate your child's profession, as a parent and a household, you will start to panic, which is what honestly I did too, initially when I was stepping into it. But if you understand it is the entry point which is under pressure, you can plan for it. There's a difference. So you can build these capabilities that survive it. And that is exactly the solvable problem I want to really put out there as part of the research.
It's really interesting because the problem is perhaps isolated is the wrong word, but the bottom rung is missing, but there are still rungs above that, is what I think you're saying there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always use the same example when I had to explain this concept about bottom rungs, right? Because it is so specific and so stark, maybe just focused on one career as such, but it's important to reflect the notions with other careers. So here is what I found. If you walk into any major law firm in London today, what used to happen is that teams of junior associates, they spend thousands of hours doing document reviews, reading contracts, flagging clauses for their clients, and summarizing, what we call as precedents in the documentation. So very repetitive, absolutely. But it was also how they learned the substance of the law, right? That is what was the bottom rung. Now, what was clear from the research also was one of the things that Thomson Reuters found out that AI now saves lawyers almost 240 hours a year on exactly this kind of work. So 240 hours that used to be billed by junior lawyers who were simultaneously building their expertise, that layer has now compressed dramatically, right? And the same pattern is playing across other fields like accountancy, financial analysis, even junior software development. So AI walks in and asks the very reasonable question, right, to the CFO or the CIO. Why do you need 12 people doing this when a model can do this overnight? Right? That's the question that they're grappling with. So the result is what I call the missing rung problem in my playbook as well, or in my research as well. Employers still want people with experience, but the jobs that used to provide that early experience, that's sort of disappearing, right? So you have a generation who are qualified, but they cannot get the foot in the door today because their qualification opportunity to turn that into a genuine expertise is sort of eroded, right? And just to close out that fundamental, you can obviously see my passion coming from this subject, and what I'm really trying to work with the parents. This is where I see two types of parents, Zoe and Paul: the ones who are stuck in fear, and the ones who are moving from fear to design, as I call it. Right. So fear says that the world has changed, and my child is at risk. Whereas design says, I understand exactly what has changed, and here is how we build around it, right? So the parents I meet who are doing the fear to design transition well are the ones who are, more confident, and they're building confidence in their households.
Oh, that's amazing because that's actually going to be a really important soft skill, isn't it? Sort of characteristic which children or kids, older kids are going to need in order to navigate this quite bumpy career path. So, could you tell us how you advised your daughter? Because this is such a wonderful story. And I love the way you've written so much about Thea in your work, because I always feel like I know Thea now, because as a parent, inevitably, I think we've walked a bit of this path, Paul and I. We sort of sat with our kids and thought, how do we guide them? So how did you guide Thea?
Yeah, interesting. It was one of those, I would say, ordinary weekday evenings having dinner together. But then, I very starkly remember Thea kind of sitting across me, which she usually does almost obliquely across the dining table. We all have our own decided seats. And she just looked up and said, Dad, am I studying the right things? Very simple question. Actually, a very devastating question when you sit with it, because here I am, spending 25 years plus in enterprise technology, a lot of that in organizations like Microsoft, really bringing up some of the technologies that we are discussing today. And I had absolutely no honest answer to give to my daughter Thea. And, sure, I could have bluffed it with my experience, but I knew the world she was walking into was, is going to be fundamentally different from the one that I had walked into, for example. And therefore, I refused to just hand over the map about careers that I knew, right? And which was already out of date. So I did what I always do. And, when I genuinely do not know something, I try to find the answer in a more structured, proper, manner, right? So to your introduction, I went back into the most prominent, most talked about, verified, creditable sources out there, 17 of them: World Economic Forum, Goldman Sachs, the McKinseys of the world, Stanford's Human Intelligence, even Anthropic's own data about labor markets. And what I did was I built a framework, as you already mentioned, that scores 35 careers for AI resistance. That's kind of expanding now in the research. But I also felt that, for me to help Thea and for Thea to absorb this information, it's not enough to just give her a 20-pager document. I need to make sure that she can query it and she can discover information from the research that is most pertinent to her. So that's how the free tools came in. I built a tool on top of the research really to help here discover information out of it. That is now available to all families. What I also did as part of that exercise was to say, hey, we now have the data and insights, but what do we do about it? What's our game plan if we look at this data? So that's how the playbook came in, because the playbook can now analyze the scores of the AI resistance and then create a bespoke, customized plan, which started with Thea, of course. But here is the thing, I felt really came out of that conversation when I was that I was having with Thea, and what I really want to tell all the parents in terms of how this all started. That is something that I discovered as part of the process, and I coined a term because none was available. I called it dadvantage. Right? It was basically my take on advantage, which is basically to say when you are in a moment that you're so close enough to the problem that you can feel it, and you're also trained enough to solve it. And when a scenario comes up like this, when your daughter is asking and both of those situations collide, use your advantage, right? So Thea gave me that moment. As I mentioned, this also gave her the confidence to look at which portions of the areas that she's passionate about and she wants to study is going to be impacted, and what does she need to do even before she starts her college applications and get into college, and what are the things that she wants to grab. So it was a deliberate structured plan that evolved out of this. So
Can I just ask whether college and going on to further education, was there ever a question with her of actually, no, that route doesn't quite seem right for me anymore? Did that come up? Because I mean, anecdotally, my son is doing A levels, which is the next step before university. He should be applying for universities if he wants to in the January or later in the year and going next summer, which is frightening in its own respect. You must be quite frightened by that realization that they're getting to that age. But part of his journey has been to witness his friends disappear into other routes. They haven't necessarily all followed down the path of A level and then getting those qualifications, but they've moved into more manual jobs, getting a trade qualification, for example. I know on the Sunday Times podcast, he talked about plumbing and building and electricians and all those sorts of things that AI isn't going to impact for the longest time. So did she ever sort of explore the idea of, well, it's not university, actually, there are other things that I could be doing?
yeah, that's a fantastic question, Paul, and something that I've been talking very vehemently in all the conversations that I'm having right now. Because this is really a question I'm pretty sure and confident every parent like you and myself is asking this secretly, but there is a fear to say this out loud, right? Because we have all been raised to believe that, degree is the destination, right? Get the grades, get the place, get the certificate. That's sort of an insurance policy for your future career. I mean, that was the contract that we were, originally signed up for. But AI literally has ripped it up. And now, here is where I want to base this out of research instead of, contributing to any sort of speculation or fear mongering, right? The New York Federal Reserve, this is more a US data, but the New York Federal Reserve found that 43% of US graduates, that's the latest data that came out of the labor statistics. And, new graduates that are 22 to 27 are underemployed right now. Not unemployed, but underemployed, right? Which is basically to say working jobs that they never needed the degree that they just spent 3 to 4 years and hundreds of thousands of, dollars spent into that. The point here is the credential alone is no longer the guarantee it was, right? But I want to be careful here because I'm not saying don't go to the university. That's not the point of this research. I mean, my daughter actually used the research to be more confident about which portion of studies that does she want to do in the university, right? And the question really is, definitely not whether my child should go to the university. The question is, what are they building while they are there and before they get there, right? Because history degree from a good like university combined with like genuine emotional intelligence, real creative output, and probably 2 summers of like meaningful human facing work, that is going to put the student in an extraordinary position in comparative to the rest of the peers, right? So the same degree as a passive box ticking exercise because it was in a great university with a subject that almost everybody seems to pursue. Now that is going to be a very expensive gamble for households to take today, right? You also mentioned about trades conversation. I think the trades conversation is almost overdue. And I think we need to speak about this, loudly and very vehemently. We have spent a generation telling working class kids that university is the only ladder for really climbing in your career. But meanwhile, I'm sure you are seeing that around you. Electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, surgical technicians, they are, multiple six-figure salaries in various countries today. And they are actually sitting on top of my AI resistance score, right? So, that's where I go back to the point that we gave our entire generation the wrong map. And, that's what I feel that as households, we have the opportunity to redraw that map today.
That's so fascinating. And because you had this amazing experience of going through all of this data from McKinsey and Goldman Sachs about the jobs that were impacted and not impacted, what surprised you? What stood out to you from doing all of that research? What do you wish more parents knew?
Yeah, and I've spoken this with as much clarity as possible. When I was developing the playbook, because I really want this capability that I discovered within my households to be there in every household. And after really 6 months of research, what I landed on is 4 capabilities that AI genuinely cannot replicate. And I mentioned that the first is emotional intelligence, not just the factor of being nice. It's real emotional intelligence, right? The capacity to sit with someone who's in genuine distress, for example, and know what they need, and then to build that trust over time. When you put that into a professional environment, to navigate the room when the when the rest of the people in that room are not going the way anyone expected, there are conflicts. So if you translate that to professions, great therapists, great nurses, great leaders in professional environments, this is what they carry that really no AI model can touch. That human, authentic, emotional intelligence. The second is creative vision, Zoe. And I want to be careful here again because this one sometimes confuses people when I have the discussion. AI can generate, it can produce, it recombines what already exists with extraordinary fluency. But what it cannot do is draw on lived experience to create something genuinely new, right? So the songwriter, for example, channeling grief into a lyric, not creating a song, but channeling that grief into a lyric that then feels like it is a song written for the listener who's listening to the song. Or the architect designing a school around how children actually move who have special needs. That originality is irreducibly human. So that is what I meant by creative vision. The third, I think Paul asked this question with respect to physical jobs. So physical dexterity, right? This one actually surprises people the most because the highest AI resistant careers in my research are not all in the arts, not all in creative or cognitive fields. Many are trades, plumbers, electricians, as I mentioned, physiotherapists. And again, we have to take it with a pinch of salt because the technology is evolving so fast that the technology we are using yesterday is already a stale version of what we are using today, right? It's moving at that pace. So nothing could be said as never with this technology, but considering the velocity and the speed at which hardware hasn't caught up with software, you can say that AI cannot yet unblock a drain, right? I mean, it cannot replace a knee, it cannot feel the tension in a muscle or give that palliative care. The fourth is ethical judgment, and this can become very very relevant considering the situations that are happening around us today. I mean, this is the one that matters most at a leadership level because AI can process, but it cannot be accountable. You see that in the news today. Even AI used in, for defense purposes. If something goes wrong, who are they complaining against? Is it AI or the person who made it, or somebody along the chain? Who is accountable for it? Right? It cannot stand in a room and say, I made this call, I stand behind it, and here is what I would do differently. Right? It'll make you believe that, but there's no accountability. In a world where, I feel AI is making more and more decisions, the humans who exercise that clear, courageous ethical judgment, they are only going to grow. So for leaders specifically, as part of your podcast, I would definitely like to address this uncomfortable truth, right? The four capabilities are exactly what every great leadership development program, has been trying to build for 20 years. AI has not created, that gap. It has just made it impossible to ignore any longer.
This is so interesting because it's immediately got my mind worrying about two different things. So I suppose the thing that really stood out for me is that in the UK in particular, often there are employers who will say, well, fine, we've recruited all these new graduates, and then they weren't quite ready for the workplace. They've got these amazing qualifications, but they don't have perhaps that experience with people, which would really make them workplace ready. And what really struck me about these four different characteristics you've described, these four capabilities, so much of it comes down to empathy, doesn't it? It's really about empathy and being able to really connect with people. And I was wondering if you saw that in itself as being a bit of a differentiator for our young people as they develop their careers.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about empathy, the irony is that nobody in this conversation seems willing to name it out loud, right? For 20 years, I would say, British employers have been systematically removing the human moments from work, right? Automating call centers, digitizing the forms, replacing the advisor with the chatbot, so on and so forth. And now those same employers are sitting in boardrooms saying, why are our young people not empathetic enough, right? You cannot follow out you cannot really take the human experience out of work and then be surprised that humans coming into it have not developed that muscle. Right? So empathy is not really a personality trait that you're born with. I mean, it is a capability that you can build over periods of practice. That's why all these leadership development programs, we have been, I feel, designing that practice out of workplaces for a decade, as I mentioned, but we are only now feeling the real consequences of it. It has gone from a bookish knowledge to something that is really knocking on our doorsteps with this technology evolution today. And here is what I feel, Zoe and Paul, my research adds to this. Emotional intelligence, if you look at the scoring, is the single most cited capability in my framework for AI resistance. And the careers that are scoring really highest are not, to everybody's surprise, most technically complex. They are the most relationally complex careers, as I call that. And the ones where, as I mentioned earlier, being genuinely present with another human being is really the entire job. So the good news is that, and definitely there is genuinely good news here, is that it is buildable. The empathy that you're talking about. I mean, there needs to be a deliberate and a systematic procedure to build it. And, I would also say that, start early, build that intentionally, and definitely stop treating empathy like a nice to have. It is actually the whole game.
It's so interesting, isn't it? It's taken the rise of all these emerging technologies for us all as humans to realize how fundamental empathy and human connection is to work. It's like the thing that really wires the workplace, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it took us a technology to really come back and inform us that, it is important to be a human. Every parent and every leader listening, to possibly take one thing away from this conversation, if they have to take just one thing, AI will do the thinking, right? There's no two ways about it. But humans will need to do the feeling. And in a world where AI does more and more of that thinking, I would say that the feeling becomes, more than a soft option for human. It becomes really the only option that matters. You mentioned empathy. I really want to, put it in bold and italics as much as possible. Empathy is not really a consolation prize for for people who cannot code, right? It is the whole competitive advantage that young people, especially who are stepping into the careers, would see as they go forward.
I love that. I was talking to my daughter, my 13-year-old last night, and a bit like your daughter asking that incredible, profound, very honest question at the dinner table. She was saying to me, Mummy, if I really work on my people skills, do you think I could really go a long way? And I said, yes, I think that is the thing to invest in. I mean, obviously, work hard, study hard at school, but that feels like it's absolutely a form of rocket fuel right now for anyone who can invest in those skills and really center them as being important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned about your daughter coming and talking about people skills. I can say that your daughter just out researched Goldman Sachs, to be honest, at 13-year-olds, you said, because what she instinctively understood, I feel, sitting across you, is the same conclusion I arrived at, after 6 months and really going deep into the nuances of the research. People skills really, Zoe, are not the backup plan. They are the plan, right? And the fact that a 13-year-old can feel that truth before she can fully articulate things in life, it tells you everything about where human intelligence actually lives. So honestly, this is actually what I would say, the advantage moment in reverse, because she gave you that, right? And a kid at that age, at the sitting across the table asking the right question, that is not a child worrying about a future. That is actually a child who already started designing what future would look like that will be most pertinent in this age.
Thank you. That's really, really reassuring. Well, I'll sit down with her and look at the playbook for sure. Can I go back to this bottom rung thing? So if the bottom rung is missing, as you say, in a lot of careers, what can we do as parents to guide our children? Obviously, there's the whole thing of what they study and what they focus on and the other capabilities they need to invest in. But if there's a profession that they absolutely have their heart set on, but it's now very hard to get into, but there are jobs in it a rung or two up the ladder. What can we do to guide our children about that?
Now we have to start going from that fear to design, right? And talk about how to convert this into a structured plan. The World Economic Forum number talks about 170 million new jobs that are projected by 2030, right? But I always say to parents, don't just read the headline and just relax. I mean, read the small print, because those 170 million jobs that World Economic Forum is talking about do not look like the ones that they are going to replace. Because some actually, if you see the job postings today, some new names are coming out. Some barely have a name yet, right? So AI prompt architects, digital ethics auditors, that are doing human and AI collaboration, and human and AI collaboration designers. So AI augmented healthcare roles, where the clinical judgment is going to be human, but the diagnostic processing is machine assisted. So a lot of those jobs are emerging right now. And unfortunately, the degree programs that position and equip the young generation for those jobs, they haven't caught up yet, right? So also there is a huge resurgence if you look at it in roles that have always existed, but suddenly they are more valued. So think about mental health professionals, going back to the same human capabilities that I discussed earlier. Skilled trades always existed. They are gaining more prominence now. Community and volunteer workers, teachers who can do things that really no app can do, right? Which is to really build a genuine relationship with a struggling child. So the question I get asked, similar to what you're asking, Zoe, here is, how do I prepare my child for jobs that do not even exist yet? And my answer: you do not prepare for the job. You build the human, right? You build the curiosity, you build the resilience, you build the social intelligence, and you build the what I call as the ethical instinct, right? So the job will find that human. And the difference now is that jobs finding them, our children will look very different from the ones that found us, going back a generation. And so this is where I, wanted to really embed that fear to design mindset shift, that philosophy. right? You stop designing around a specific job role like we have always been programmed to do. You start designing around a set of capabilities. That is a much more durable strategy in comparison. And I feel a much more interesting one as a household.
I see that every day. I work with, I feel like I'm in the eye of the storm because I work predominantly with accountancy firms and partly on strategy. And what we have in accountancy firms is that the qualifications are changing. So the way that the qualification is built is changing to suit the world that we live in. And that's a process that's going to take the next 2 to 3 years before you see the first people come through that program. Add to that, you have a layer of people within the organization who've been through a global pandemic and haven't had the opportunity to practice some of those skills that we've been talking about, empathy and emotional intelligence, those types of things. They just haven't flexed that muscle enough. And at the top of the organization, you have a specific trait around the owners, the partners that run these organizations, some of whom have those skills and some of them who don't. So you've got this kind of perfect storm of skills deficit, but with the people that are on the new training who are learning those human skills, who are being taught those human skills more purposefully, coming into that organization and almost moving past that middle layer who might feel a little bit lost. So I have a theory that those people, those young people that are coming into organizations, accountancy firms, law firms, and all those types of organizations might go faster than some of the current employees within those fields. And that's your next tier of leadership. It's going to be accelerated through. So it's really interesting to hear what you're predicting. And I think it's absolutely right. What we should be concentrated on, Zoe and I, like we're going to have dinner in a minute. We'll sit at the kitchen table and I'll re-emphasize the fact that my kids need to focus on building those human skills because that will just stand them in good stead for whatever it is that they go into next. And as you say, the job will find them eventually, hopefully.
I mean, Paul, perfect storm is exactly the right phrase. Thank you for raising that. I'll probably use that in some of my outreaches because I really want to build on what you said because I think there are actually three perfect storms that are hitting simultaneously. Because the first storm I feel is structural. You mentioned accountancy firms and strategies firms that have spent like multiple decades building qualification frameworks that measure technical competence, right? And it did that beautifully, but it failed to measure human capability almost to nil because the ACAs, the chartered financial analysts, the MBAs, um, extraordinary rigor was put on the analytical side, but almost nothing if you look at that courseware on the relational side, right? So you were already producing leaders, to your point, of folks sitting on the helm who were technically brilliant, really understood the nuances of business, but humanly underdeveloped, before any of this new revolution actually started. So definitely the structural deficiency, which is a storm. Then you mentioned about generational, right? The pandemic. What a great example and to really depict what is playing out right now. The pandemic took almost 2 to 3 years out of the most critical window for building human capability, right? The early 20s for one portion of the generation. Those are the years when you actually sit in your open plan offices, as most of the offices are right now. You read the room, you watch how your senior colleagues are sort of handling a difficult client, and you're also allowed to make mistakes in real time and learn from it with real people who help you recover from them, right? So that entire apprenticeship in being human at work, that quite quietly eroded during that pandemic period. I mean, it was replaced by a screen and a mute button, which often doesn't work in a conversation, right? And we have to say you're on mute. You cannot really learn empathy on a Zoom call. I know we are kind of replicating that right now, but you cannot learn empathy in a Zoom call. You just cannot. And the third storm I feel is, and this one I feel hits a lot of people the hardest, especially at the top, which is where the leadership is. It got them to the top as a leader, and it modeled technical excellence for the rest of the organization. The organization also rewarded it. They promoted it. Promotions were based on that. And now they're sitting at the head of these organizations that desperately need something that was never asked to demonstrate on the way up. I mean, that's really not a criticism. I was part of that chain. this is actually a structural, I feel, for lack of better terminology, a trap, right? So what we genuinely have, Paul, to your question, and thank you for asking this, we now have a generation that is entering the workforce without that relational foundation, being led by people who never had it built, explicitly for them, right? So this is not a skills gap. I feel that, you know, AI arriving at exactly this moment is not really creating that chasm, but, it is actually showing that floodlight that I feel, I have very strong confidence as we speak more and more about it in forums like yours, will finally illuminate how that relational intensity matters and how deep it needs to be within our society.
Wow, this is incredible, Babbitt. This has just got my brain whirring about AI is almost like a reckoning, isn't it? Because if I think about some of my friends, colleagues who are near the top of that corporate ladder or maybe CEO in a charity where you were incentivized to have a certain skill set. That was the job, is the reward for how you manage your career and your portfolio of skills. And then now in 2026, that set of skills isn't really working for anyone, right? Whether it's the young person who is planning for college or whether it's the CEO who's suddenly going, oh my God, everything is changing around me. That's huge, isn't it? That's shining a light on what we haven't got right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I would say is, this is, because we've spoken a bit about this. AI really did not break that system that you're talking about, Zoe. It just, I feel that it has really surfaced that reckoning for us. And, we built an entire civilization, as you called it, on incentives around, not always the right things. I mean, we incentivized grade over the growth as a human, right? We credentialized people over, the capability that they bring in. So the qualification over the human being holding it, you know for a long time, it really worked mostly because the system rewarded the people who played by those rules. So everyone kept playing, I mean, naturally. So here is a reckoning, I feel. I think the things we over rewarded, as you called out, like routine analysis, templated thinking, knowledge that was easily processable, those are precisely the things AI is just going to, snatch the carpet under your feet. It's already doing it faster, cheaper, better. And it works 24 by 7, doesn't even ask for a salary raise, right? And those are the things, the things that we under rewarded, like judgment, empathy that we spoke about, creativity, even that ethical courage to speak out. Those are precisely the things AI cannot touch. We've really spent, I feel, multiple decades building a meritocracy system that accidentally optimized for the automatable task, right? So now I feel the reckoning has come to us, and the honestly, it is time we start building differently. Not leave it to a plan of how AI is going to shape up. Do it now, not next year. Do it now. Right. That's my message as part of the research as well. Preparedness.
This is incredible, Babette, because when we started this conversation today, you know, we were originally talking about how we need to advise the young people, the kids in our lives. And I've learned so much from you about that. And it's also really made me think about my own skills and the skills of the leaders I work with and how we all need to evolve. We all need to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was one of the stark things that came out of the conversations and the feedback that came after the research. The research pointed to two things. One is the parents, especially in the area that I am in, which is surrounded by technology giants like Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Google, Expedia, T-Mobile, very, very successful parents, right? Being in exactly those same careers that are now been discussed openly about being challenged. And there is a fear amongst the children who want to think differently as they step into the career to ask that crucial question to their parents who they see are being very successful in their current career, right? How do they even approach that conversation about things that they want to do completely differently, or sometimes completely on the opposite side of the spectrum as where their parents are. And on the other side, parents themselves who are having trepidation about the successful careers that they are in right now, but things eroding in terms of opportunities and what AI is really taking, how do they start framing the conversation with their children? So what works both the ways. And, here is where I think every person listening today, based on some of the conversation that I've had, I really feel I need to say this. They need to sit with this, like dichotomy and this debate for a moment, because the four human superpowers, as you correctly called out, Zoe, are not, a curriculum for teenagers and teenagers alone, right? They are a daily practice for every human being who really wants to remain genuinely valuable in the world that is here today and that is going to arrive. So that includes everyone in this room. It includes you, Paul, myself, all the parents. And I'll be honest with you, building this research actually really humbled me. I might sound as very deterministic about what I know today, but honestly, it really humbled me because I went in thinking I was really building something for Thea. And, I came out realizing, which is the reason why I think it's finding its position in the different households. I came out realizing I was building something for myself as much as it is for her, right? And that is why I wanted to give it to the rest of the households. And I think that that is the gift inside the reckoning, if you're willing to receive it, right? That is really a moment for us to redesign how we raise the next generation. And our children are watching us for the answer. They're not listening. They're actually watching us demonstrate those behaviors.
So, where next for what you're doing? Because you've done all this incredible work so far. You've started all these fantastic conversations, providing this brilliant support for parents. Where do you want to go next with this?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. As I've reiterated, both of these tools are permanently free. I will never change that. The reach that they have built, actually, the numbers, as I look at the statistics today, is 30,000 families across 128 countries. I mean, that is the whole point. So,
Congrats. Amazing.
so I definitely, absolutely will never put this behind a paywall because I don't want to sell career anxiety to parents, right? They are already drowning in it with everything that is happening with AI. But where we are heading next is a bit more deeper. And this actually came from the parents, the children, the educators, the colleges that I'm working with, bodies like UN and UNESCO who are trying to position this and get this into the hands of the folks who don't get that easily, with less resources. I can't talk about all the features because we are still developing, but few things that I'm really excited about. I mean, first is a girls focused research layer, because how AI affects young women, that is different and is genuinely, I feel, underexplored. And I feel that that is one of the most important conversations that we need to have, right? So expect something that is really focused around girls and girls empowerment in this age of AI. I also realized as we were going through this conversation and similar conversations that there needs to be country specific guidance, right? AI family counselor looking at a career in India would be very different from somebody looking at that in Congo or even in developed nations like UK. So I want to have structured evidence-based conversation and enable that for households, but that are more region specific, right? I think, to your point, the media reception has been extraordinary. Sometimes I really have imposter syndrome kind of going into these conversations. Sunday Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, Seattle Times, Toronto Star. The the names just keep increasing, but the signal I trust really is not any of the media publications, right, or any of the multiple 15 seconds of fame that I've now got, but it is really the parent who is now forwarding the link to another parent at midnight that I see in my social media. Uh, and they say, read this. I mean, this is not manufactured. I feel that this is a community building effort. And, to your question, the next versions of this are actually being built by parents, by the young generation who are trying to solve this. I'm actually handing over the baton to multiple such families in terms of future development. So a lot of exciting features coming in. I think, it is very gratifying to see that households are taking control over what future means for their household.
That's incredible, Babith. Thank you so much for coming on today. You're doing such a wonderful thing for society, for skills, for us parents, for the children who are right in the jaws of this absolute challenge around careers and what to study. And we are very, very grateful to you. And we hope you'll come back on our podcast in the future and tell us more as this all goes to the next stage.
I can't thank you enough, Zoe and Paul, for this opportunity, to really help me amplify this message and hand over the powers to every household. Thank you for this opportunity.
And thank you very much for coming on. It's been absolutely brilliant conversation and one that we can't wait to share with our listeners.
Thank you, Paul.
Many thanks to Babith for joining us on the podcast. That was one of my favourite ever conversations that we've had.
Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for Babith for coming on. We should add that following our conversation with Babith, there have been many stories about the shifting job markets and expectations that we'll link to one or two of them in the show notes. Jeff Bezos being one, and I can't help but feel that a major theme of our next season might be how the jobs market begins to reset. What are the jobs we'll lose, and what are the jobs of the future? The irony, of course, not lost on anyone, that Mr. Bezos doesn't really need to worry too much about losing his job or finding another one.
Yes, I suspect he'll be fine. I don't think he's going to need our help anytime soon. So, this is our last episode until September, very sadly, when we will be back with a bang with some amazing guests. As always, we really do appreciate that you've listened all the way to the end of the episode. Thank you. You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us reach more people. So, if you've enjoyed what you've heard, do share it with a friend or colleague.
Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you back in September with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
Bye for now.
Bye.